incumbent properties, we've got to look at adaptive pathways, so we don't necessarily have to look at, okay, let's retreat completely because this is going to be a disaster area in 40 years' time. We can look at, well, what can we do now to minimise those risks? Is it dune protection or something of that order, or is it constructing some infrastructure to provide protection for the short to medium term? Do we then need to be looking at how we can make those houses more relocatable? Do we as a council need to be looking at what land we might have surplus to manage that?
But you want some government leadership on this as well. So
all
this
absolutely.
effort's going into a climate change commission and areas of, and obviously this drive to cut emissions, but you want some government action or leadership on this issue.
So we're one of the few countries in the OECD that doesn't have a national strategy to deal with adaptation as a result of climate change. So we need to get that one underway. We need to have that long view at central government level. We need to have a view of what is the risk that this country faces from climate change and how we prioritise that. We need to be looking at legislation that aligns, whether that's the RMA, the Building Act and local government legislation, so that the framework is there for the long term and on a bipartisan basis.
This is a strange question, but I'm not that familiar with insurance premiums in the fine print. But is climate change actually worded and written into premiums yet?
Climate change per se, no. But
will it be soon?
Oh, look, it's the effect of climate change. So if it's flood elsewhere in the world, in many countries, flood is an additional optional risk that you take out for your house. In New Zealand, we benefit from a all-risk policies largely. So you buy your house insurance, it covers you for earthquake, flood, etc. So the question is will the day come where insurers will be saying in some parts, well, actually, if you want flood, then that's something that you'll have to pay something additional for because you're in a higher risk area. So it's the effects of climate change rather than climate change per se, because you need to have some clarity of definition.
But do you think we could see a written into premiums, where it says, the effects of climate change, that terminology?
I think it would need to be more precise than that because the effects of climate change are vast and numerous. So, it's acidification of the oceans, it's the effects on...
Be an interesting point though, won't it? Because if that does happen, that's quite, once insurance companies, once that sector decides, then that's a business-led decision, and that's probably a pretty bit of a line in the sand, so to speak.
Yeah, but insurance policies are about specifically identifying and defining the risk, and therefore climate change itself is far too broad a term to be able to just plonk into a policy. So I think it needs to be quite specific to flood, wind damage or whatever.
Just before we move on, what's your advice to Kiwis, young Kiwis maybe buying houses in areas and when they're thinking about insurance, they're thinking about climate change, they're thinking about these issues? What would you advise them to be thinking about and doing?
Well, I think the same advice to anybody purchasing a house. Have a look at the Land Information Memorandum. Have a look at what the council has identified as hazards. So there are councils around the country, like in Nelson, for instance, where you can go on to a Nelson City Council site and look at what their projections are for flood 50 and 100 years out. Now, no one's going to live to 100 years if they're purchasing it. Well, they may be. But have a look at where you're going to be locating that house. And I think, and what we've seen in other countries, unfortunately, is those at the low income end are the ones that tend to end up in the cheaper properties, which are the properties that end up being the ones most at risk. And the last thing we want is people on low incomes in high risk areas, because that becomes a political economy issue for the government.